So let's take a look here at a couple of my blog posts from the time, from when the Derek Chauvin trial was running on. Again, the evidence would have been largely the same in all these cases. So I'll pull this up first, see if I can enlarge it so it's a little easier to read. But of course, I'll read the relevant sections myself. Tighten this up here. So this is day 9 of the trial. And the state is still presenting evidence. It's still the state's case. They haven't yet rested. And the evidence is not a compelling narrative of guilt for Derek Chauvin or any of the 4 officers involved. So let me go ahead and start here. Today begins the 9th day of the prosecution in the Chauvin trial, presenting their case in chief to the jury. And from the perspective of this small town lawyer, that would be me. Thank you very much. Things don't appear to have been going well for the state so far. Indeed, things appear to be degenerating for the state, and badly. That's going to be a theme throughout these 2 blog posts, folks. Now, obviously, Chauvin and all the other officers got convicted. To my mind, that simply means that the jury was not an unbiased, reasonable jury. They were politically motivated, but they were perhaps motivated out of fear. Remember, Minnesota was on fire, as were many cities around the country over this event. Continuing now, followers of this trial will remember how the state began its narrative of guilt to the jury in its opening statement. Lots of emotion, sorrow over the loss of George Floyd, a man struggling with demons but dearly loved by his family and community. Was he really? The guy who held a loaded gun to the belly of a pregnant woman in the act of robbing her, of home invading her? Ongoing. We had an entire series of bystander witnesses still exhibiting the shock of having watched Floyd apparently die in the street. Many of those witnesses openly sobbed and cried on the witness stand, some to the point where the court had to be recessed to allow them to recover and continue their testimony. Powerful stuff on an emotional level. But eventually the state ran out of sobbing, crying bystander witnesses, and the prosecution's narrative was obliged to begin talking about facts rather than emotions. And the apparent trend, to my eye, is that the more the state talks about facts, the more their narrative of guilt begins to closely resemble the defense narrative of innocence. From the state's telling, fentanyl had nothing substantive to do with Floyd's death. Sure, Floyd was an addict, but that wasn't a factor to which we should attribute his death, merely another reason to sympathize with the struggling Floyd, who was, after all, still a loved human being despite his addictions. Don't pay any attention to the drug narrative. That's not what killed Floyd, according to the prosecution. Rather, what killed Floyd was Derek Chauvin's blood choke knee to Floyd's neck. Or maybe it was the respiratory choke delivered by Chauvin's knee to Floyd's neck. Or maybe it was mechanical asphyxiation resulting from the pressure applied by all 3 officers holding Floyd prone. Or maybe it was positional asphyxia because they failed to put Floyd in the recovery position. Or maybe it was that the officers should have started chest compressions on the handcuffed, huge, just violent Floyd before EMS showed up. Or maybe, does it really matter? Chauvin's knee, excessive force, not a trained technique. That's what we heard from the state's witnesses. Unfortunately for the state, many of its own witnesses, especially its use of force and medical witnesses, whether existing Minneapolis PD trainers or well-paid expert witnesses from out of town, have testified in ways that substantively undercut that narrative of the state. So far in the state's case, we've heard of the state's own witnesses and experts testify that Chauvin's knee was on Floyd's back and shoulder blades, not his neck. We've heard them testify that not only was Chauvin's force not excessive, he would have been privileged to use more force and declined to do so. A choice they, the state's witnesses, characterized as de-escalation. We've seen photographs from Minneapolis PD training materials showing officers being trained to place their knees on suspects in exactly the manner Chauvin had placed his knee on Floyd. None of that can be said to buttress the state's still vague and ambiguous narrative of guilt. Even now, 9 days in, we still don't have an actual medical opinion of Floyd's cause of death. We'll get to that tomorrow. I'll cover that blog post in today's show as well. Other than cardiac arrest induced by apparent asphyxia. Was that asphyxia caused by the officers charged in this case? Perhaps. Alternatively, is there an equally or even more likely explanation for Floyd's death? Perhaps the astonishing high levels of fentanyl in his system? 3 times fatal levels, folks. And the fentanyl discovered eventually in both the Mercedes SUV that Floyd was driving and the squad car from which Floyd achieved his violent escape? After all, how does fentanyl kill? By depressing respiratory function. That is, by chemical induction of asphyxia, which eventually, of course, will result in cardiac arrest, which is how Floyd died. The more the case turns to drugs, not in the hypothetical sense of Floyd's generalized and tragic lifelong struggle with addiction, but in the specific sense that his body was full of a drug whose lethal effect was cessation of respiration, the more reasonable doubt is raised about the state's claim that the causal factor in Floyd's death was the officers charged in this case. Yesterday, we saw the state compelled to begin presenting witnesses. Again, all state investigators are private scientists paid by the state who provided concrete, investigative, photographic, forensic, and chemical testimony about the lethal fentanyl found in both Floyd's own vehicle and the squad car he fought his way out of. All of that moves the collective narrative away from Chauvin's knee as a cause of Floyd's death and toward Floyd's poorly made decision to hide his toxic drugs from police by ingesting them as being what killed him. Soon, perhaps today, we'll start hearing from the experts who will testify not just about the drugs found in Floyd's vehicle in the squad car, but about the lethal levels of those drugs found in Floyd himself. And that can only move the narrative of cause of death further from Chauvin's knee and closer to Floyd effectively killing himself with a lethal overdose of fentanyl. That can only raise even further reasonable doubt. Juries are always dangerous and unpredictable things, and as a professional, I know better than to place a wager on what a verdict might be. That's even more so the case when we have the dynamic of mob violence, rioting, looting, and arson hanging over this case, and a government unable or unwilling to meet its fundamental responsibility of securing the safety of its citizens and their property. So there's no way I'd be so bold as to say that an acquittal in this case is certain or even likely. But on this 9th day of hearing the state make its best arguments, the prospects for acquittal look more, not less likely each day. That said, no one can know yet what this new day will bring. From the state's continued testimony of its witnesses and experts, perhaps today will be the day that the state progresses closer to, rather than further from, a compelling narrative of Chauvin's knee as the causal factor of Floyd's death. And that's what we did over the course of that day, was follow the proceedings in real time. So let's look. That was the kind of the run up to that day's testimony.